The island arrived the way all terrible things arrive. Slowly, then all at once. Bumpy Johnson had heard about Alcatraz, the way everyone heard about Alcatraz, through the specific mythology that the place had cultivated for itself, the stories that circulated in the back rooms and the holding cells and the federal courtrooms of mid-century America about what the island was, what it did to men, what came back from it and what didn't. The rock, the end of the line. The place where the federal government sent the people it had decided were too significant, too dangerous, too fundamentally resistant to the ordinary corrections of the prison system to be housed anywhere else. He had heard these stories. He had understood them the way a man understands information about a place he has never been, intellectually, abstractly, as a set of facts that had not yet been tested against direct experience. What he had not understood, what could not be understood in advance, was the specific quality of the place itself, the way the water surrounded it not just physically but psychologically. The knowledge that escape was not possible, not merely because the walls were high and the guards were alert, but because the currents would kill you in minutes, because the mainland was close enough to see on clear days and far enough to be unreachable. The way that proximity combined with impossibility produced something in the men who lived on the island that was different from what ordinary imprisonment produced, a specific awareness of the world's continued existence alongside their own complete separation from it. Bumpy arrived in 1937. He was 32 years old. He had been convicted on federal narcotics charges and sentenced to federal custody. The specific facility to which he was assigned was not Alcatraz immediately, but Alcatraz was where he ended up, transferred after incidents in his first placement that the federal system had decided required the specific containment that only one facility in the country provided. The warden who would define his Alcatraz years was named Harold Bennett. Bennett had been at Alcatraz for 6 years when Bumpy arrived, had worked his way up through the federal prison system with the methodical efficiency of a man who believed deeply in what the system was designed to accomplish, and who had dedicated his professional life to making it accomplish that as completely as possible. He was not a cruel man in the obvious sense. He did not take pleasure in suffering for its own sake. He was, in many ways, a principled man, a man who operated according to a clear and consistent set of beliefs about human nature and the purpose of incarceration, and what the relationship between the institution and the incarcerated should be. Those beliefs were, in their application to Bumpy Johnson, precisely and completely wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being immoral, though there were dimensions of their application that raised that question. Wrong in the more fundamental sense of being based on a misunderstanding of who Bumpy Johnson was, and what would and would not work on him. Bennett had broken men before. He had a record of success with difficult prisoners, men who arrived at Alcatraz having been defined by their intractability, and who, under his management, had been reduced to something more compliant. He understood this success as evidence that his methods worked. What he did not understand was that his methods worked on a specific kind of man, and that the specific kind of man, Bumpy Johnson, fell entirely outside the category in which those methods were effective. This misunderstanding would define the relationship between the two men for years. Bennett's initial assessment of Bumpy, conducted through the combination of official file review and personal observation that constituted his standard approach to new significant arrivals, produced a profile that was accurate in its factual dimensions and entirely misleading in its implications. The file said, significant criminal enterprise, high intelligence, leadership qualities, likely to attempt to maintain influence over other inmates, potential threat to institutional order. All of this was true. What the file did not and could not say, what Bennett's own assessment did not arrive at, was the specific nature of the intelligence and the specific form that the leadership took, and what this meant for how the man would respond to institutional pressure. Bennett's theory of prison management, refined over years and tested against hundreds of men, was essentially this: every man has a breaking point, a threshold beyond which the costs of resistance exceed the costs of compliance, and the job of a skilled warden is to find that threshold and operate just above it. Some men break quickly at the first application of significant pressure. Some take longer, require sustained campaigns of isolation and deprivation, and the systematic removal of the things that make prison life survivable. But every man breaks. This was Bennett's foundational conviction, and it had been confirmed often enough by experience that he held it with the certainty of something empirically demonstrated rather than merely assumed. He was wrong about Bumpy Johnson, but he would take several years to discover this, and the discovery, when it came, would change him in ways he had not anticipated. The early period of Bumpy's time at Alcatraz was defined by Bennett's first campaign: standard initial pressure, the removal of privileges, the assignment of the most undesirable work details, the careful management of social connections to prevent the establishment of the kind of influence network that men like Bumpy naturally built wherever they were placed. Bennett had seen new arrivals attempt to organize before. He understood the mechanisms and had developed effective countermeasures. What he had not encountered, or had not recognized when he encountered it, was a man who built his influence not through the ordinary mechanisms of prison politics, intimidation and favor exchange, and the strategic control of scarce resources, but through something that the institutional framework had no real countermeasure for. Bumpy built his influence in Alcatraz the same way he had built it in Harlem, through genuine regard for the people around him, through the specific quality of attention that made people feel seen in an environment designed to make them feel invisible, through the patient, sustained demonstration that he was someone who meant what he said and did what he promised, that his word could be relied on in a context where almost nobody's word could be relied on. He read everything he could get access to, and he read with the same quality of attention he brought to everything else, not consuming but genuinely engaging, treating the books as conversations rather than objects. He talked about what he read with the men around him, not performing intellectualism, but genuinely sharing something he had found interesting or useful or worth arguing about. He played chess with anyone who wanted to play, at whatever level they were at, and he taught people how to play better without making them feel diminished by the instruction. He also did something that was, in the specific context of Alcatraz, genuinely remarkable. He maintained his dignity with a completeness that the institutional environment was specifically designed to erode. Alcatraz worked on men through the systematic removal of everything that constituted personhood, through the reduction of human beings to their number and their compliance level and their position in the institutional hierarchy. Most men, under sustained pressure of this kind, eventually internalized some version of the institution's assessment of them. They became, in part, what the institution said they were. Bumpy didn't. Not because he was performing resistance, not because he was making a point, because he genuinely understood himself in a way that the institution's framework could not reach. He knew who he was before Alcatraz. He knew who he was during it. And he was confident in the specific way of a man whose self-knowledge is grounded in something real rather than in the opinions of the people around him. That who he was would still be true when Alcatraz was over. This was the thing Bennett could not find the lever for. He could control the external conditions. He could remove privileges and assign difficult work and restrict social contact and manage every dimension of Bumpy's physical environment. with the comprehensive authority that the institutional framework provided. What he could not control was what happened inside Bumpy Johnson's mind when all of those external pressures were applied. And what happened was, from Bennett's perspective, almost nothing. The man continued to read, continued to think, continued to engage with the people around him with the same quality of care that had characterized his relationships on the outside, continued to be, in every way that mattered, himself. The isolation campaign was Bennett's second major effort. Solitary confinement, the removal of all social contact, the reduction of existence to the cell and the mandatory work periods and nothing else. This was the tool that had broken men who had seemed unbreakable by other means. The specific human need for contact, for the presence of other people, for the ongoing confirmation that you existed in relation to something beyond the walls of a 6 by 9 foot cell, was something that most men, no matter how strong, could not sustain the deprivation of for extended periods. Bumpy spent extended periods in isolation. He came out of them the same way he went in. Not unchanged. Nobody comes through significant isolation unchanged, but not broken. The specific thing that Bennett's isolation was designed to break, the self that constituted resistance to the institution's framework, remained intact. What Bumpy experienced in isolation, and what he described years later to the small number of people he discussed his prison years with, was not comfortable. He was honest about that. The absence of human contact was genuinely difficult. The specific kind of difficult that strips away whatever you have been using to distract yourself from the fundamental questions and leaves you with nothing but those questions and whatever resources you have developed for engaging with them. What he had, it turned out, was enough. He had the books he had read and the conversations those books were continuing inside his mind. He had the chess games he had played and the positions he had analyzed and the theoretical problems he had worked through in his head when there was no board available. He had the specific quality of interior life that comes from years of genuine engagement with ideas. The ability to think not just reactively but generatively, to produce new thoughts rather than just cycling through existing ones. He also had, and this was perhaps the most important thing, the long game. He understood Alcatraz as a finite situation, not a comfortable situation, not a just situation, not a situation he would have chosen, but finite. It would end. He would leave it. And the man who left it would be the man who had gone through it, which meant that the most important thing to protect during the years on the island was not his physical comfort or his social position or any of the things that the institution's pressure campaigns were designed to target. The most important thing to protect was the version of himself that would walk out the gate when the time came. This was, in its specific practical terms, a form of patience that exceeded anything Bennett had encountered in a significant prisoner. It was not the patience of a man waiting for an opportunity. It was the patience of a man who understood that the opportunity he was waiting for was simply the passage of time, that the institution's power was real but temporary, and that his job was to be intact when its temporariness was over. Bennett recognized, gradually, that his campaigns were not working. The recognition was uncomfortable. His professional identity was built on the conviction that he could break any man given sufficient time and the right application of institutional tools. Bumpy Johnson's resistance was not defiant. It was not aggressive. There was nothing to punish, nothing to escalate against. The man simply continued to be himself, in a way that seemed almost indifferent to the pressure being applied. Not because he didn't feel it, but because feeling it didn't change what he was. The conversations between them began about 2 years into Bumpy's time at Alcatraz. They began because Bennett was trying to understand what he was dealing with. approaching the problem the way an intelligent man approaches a problem he has not been able to solve through his existing methods. He started talking to Bumpy. These conversations were not social occasions. Bennett was clear about that, and Bumpy understood it. They were the specific conversations of a man who wanted to understand something he didn't understand, using the most direct available resource, which was the person himself. And Bumpy, who was genuinely interested in people and who found the Warden's combination of genuine conviction and fundamental misunderstanding intellectually interesting, engaged with the conversations honestly. What emerged from those conversations, over months of occasional meetings in Bennett's office, was a relationship that neither man had anticipated and that both found, in retrospect, more significant than most of the relationships either had formed in their respective professional lives. Bennett began to understand, through the conversations, the specific nature of what he was dealing with. Not just that his methods weren't working, but why they weren't working, what the specific architecture of Bumpy Johnson's character was, and why it placed him outside the category of men on whom the standard tools were effective. He understood, gradually and with genuine intellectual difficulty, that the resistance was not a performance, that there was no hidden vulnerability underneath it, no thing that the right kind of pressure would eventually reach, that Bumpy Johnson was not a man who had built his apparent composure on a fragile foundation, which was what Bennett had always assumed, because fragile foundations were what he was equipped to find and exploit. The composure was the foundation. There was no separation between the surface and the depth. This was the most unsettling recognition of Bennett's professional career. It required him to revise not just his assessment of this particular prisoner, but his foundational conviction about what prisoners were. His belief that every man had a breaking point was not wrong, exactly, but it was incomplete. It did not account for the possibility of a man who had done the specific work of building himself on a foundation that institutional pressure could not reach, who had spent years developing an understanding of himself that was independent of external validation, or the opinions of the world around him. Bumpy, for his part, came to understand Bennett in ways that complicated his initial assessment of the man. His initial assessment had been the simple one. This man represents the institution. The institution is my adversary, and the relationship between us is therefore adversarial. This was not wrong, but it was incomplete. Bennett was a man who had dedicated his life to a system he genuinely believed in, who exercised the authority that system gave him with what he understood as professional responsibility, who was capable of genuine reflection when his assumptions were challenged by evidence. In one of their later conversations, Bennett said something that Bumpy found genuinely surprising. He said, "I came into this work believing that what we do here is correct, that the purpose is right and the methods are sound. You have made me question the methods in ways I did not anticipate." Bumpy looked at him for a moment before responding. "Is that uncomfortable?" "Yes," Bennett said. "It is." "Good," Bumpy said, not unkindly, with the specific directness of a man who respected honesty enough to respond to it honestly. Uncomfortable is where thinking starts. The years on the island produced something in Bumpy Johnson that people who knew him before and after both commented on, though they described it in different ways. Dorothy, who had known him better than almost anyone, said that he came back from the years of federal imprisonment quieter in a specific way, not diminished, not less present, but more settled, as though the years of having nothing except himself had completed something that had previously been incomplete, had forced a kind of accounting that normal life, with all its constant motion and external engagement, never required. Roosevelt, who had worked with him operationally both before and after the prison years, said something similar but from a different angle. He said, before, he was patient because he had learned that patience worked. After, he was patient because that's what he was. It went all the way down. The distinction matters. A man who is patient because he has learned that patience produces better outcomes is a man whose patience is conditional, who could, under sufficient pressure, be moved to impatience. A man whose patience is constitutive, who is patient the way water is wet, is a different kind of challenge for anyone trying to find the lever that moves him. Alcatraz had not created this quality in Bumpy, but it had refined it. The years of sustained institutional pressure, the repeated campaigns that found nothing to work with, the isolation that produced reflection rather than breakdown, all of it had compressed and clarified something that had been present but had not been fully tested before. When he left federal custody and returned to Harlem, he was not the same man who had left. He was more of the same man. The island had taken everything that wasn't essential, and the essential had remained. Harold Bennett retired from the federal prison system in 1952. In the private notes he kept throughout his career, which were discovered among his papers after his death, and which are now held in a university archive in California, there is an entry from the period after Bumpy Johnson's departure from Alcatraz that reads, "In part, I have spent 20 years in this work, believing that the purpose of this institution is the breaking of resistance. I am no longer certain this is correct. I encountered a prisoner who could not be broken by any method available to me, not because he was protected by something external, but because he had built something internal that my methods could not reach. I do not know what to make of this. I know only that it requires me to think again about what this work is for and whether I have been doing it correctly." He never published these notes. He never spoke publicly about Bumpy Johnson. But the entry exists, and it says what it says. And it says it in the handwriting of a man who spent his professional life doing something he believed in, and who ended that career having encountered something that made him question whether his belief had been correctly placed. Bumpy Johnson, for his part, spoke about the prison years rarely and selectively. When he did, he spoke about them not as a period of suffering, though they were that, and not as a period of triumph, though there were dimensions of triumph in them, but as a period of education. He used that word specifically. Education, the most demanding kind, the kind that has no curriculum and no teacher and no graduation, only the ongoing requirement to understand what you are when there is nothing around you that wants to affirm it. He said once to a young man in Harlem who had asked him what the years inside had taught him, that the most important thing he had learned was the difference between what other people's assessments of you can take and what they can't. They can take your freedom, he said. They can take your comfort, your connections, your time, your options. All of that is real and all of it costs, but they can't take what you know about yourself, and they can't take what you've built inside that knowing. The only person who can take that is you, if you let their assessment of you replace your own. He paused and then added, "The warden thought his job was to replace my assessment of myself with the institution's assessment of me. He worked at it for years. He was very good at his work. He had just picked the wrong subject." The specific thing that Alcatraz could not do to Bumpy Johnson was, in the end, the most revealing thing about him. Not the empire he had built, not the intelligence he had demonstrated, not the patience he had shown in 100 different strategic contexts. Those things were visible. They had been observed and documented and discussed by the people who watched him operate in the world. What Alcatraz revealed was the interior, the specific quality of what he had built inside himself. over years of thinking carefully about who he was and why and what he would and would not compromise, was tested by the most comprehensive pressure the American state could bring to bear on a single individual, and it held. Not because he was superhuman, because he had done the work, the specific, unglamorous work of understanding himself at a level that external pressure could not destabilize. Harold Bennett had tried to break Bumpy Johnson. He had tried with every tool his institution provided. He had tried for years, with genuine professional commitment, with the specific conviction of a man who believed in what he was doing. He had not succeeded. And in the private notes that nobody read until after his death, in the careful, honest handwriting of a man accounting for his own career, he had acknowledged this. Had acknowledged it not as a failure of nerve or method, but as an encounter with something that his framework had not accounted for. A man built on a foundation that institutional pressure could not reach. In Harlem, in the years after Bumpy's return, people said he came back different. They were right. He had gone in a man who knew what he was. He came back a man who had been shown, by the most comprehensive possible test, that he was right about what he knew. The island had tried its best. The island's best had not been enough. That was the lesson. Not a lesson about the institution or its methods or the specific warden who had applied them. A lesson about the specific thing that no institution can touch. When it is built correctly and maintained with the kind of commitment that Bumpy Johnson brought to everything. The knowledge of yourself, the real kind, the kind that holds. To understand what Alcatraz meant for Harlem while Bumpy was gone, you have to understand what Bumpy meant for Harlem when he was present. Not the criminal operation, though that was real and significant. The other thing, the thing that existed alongside the operation, and that was, in some ways, more durably important. Harlem in the 1930s and 1940s was a community under sustained pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The economic pressure of poverty that the Depression had deepened, and that the structural exclusion of Black Americans from most legitimate economic opportunities maintained at a chronic level. The political pressure of a city that was genuinely indifferent to the neighborhood's needs when it was not actively hostile to them. The social pressure of existing in an America that had very specific and very limiting ideas about what Black people were and what they could be and what they were entitled to. Bumpy Johnson's presence in Harlem constituted a specific kind of counter-pressure against all of this. Not through any official channel, not through political organizing or civic leadership or any of the legitimate structures that were supposed to provide communities with their representation, through the simple, consistent, visible demonstration that a Black man from Charleston with $47 could build something. In this city that the city had not been designed to allow, that intelligence and patience and genuine investment in community could produce power even when the structures of power were systematically arranged against you. When he was taken away, something in Harlem felt his absence in a way that was not primarily about the criminal operation. The operation continued, managed by the people he had trained and trusted, generating its contribution to the community's economic life. What was harder to replace was what his presence meant. The specific reassurance of it, the knowledge that he was there, that if something needed to be handled, it would be handled, that the community had, in some imperfect and complicated but genuine form, a protector. Dorothy held the operation together during the years of federal imprisonment. She did this with the same quiet, comprehensive efficiency that had always characterized her management of the things Bumpy trusted her with, and she did it across multiple periods of incarceration, across the specific uncertainties that arose each time the question of whether the framework with the Italian families would hold without Bumpy's direct presence needed to be answered. She was, in this period, more essential to the survival of what he had built than anyone except Bumpy himself. She understood this, and she carried it with the same composure that she brought to everything, without complaint and without the expectation of recognition that she never received from the official record, but that she received, consistently and genuinely, from the people who worked alongside her. She also wrote to him, regularly, throughout the years, letters that constituted a specific kind of ongoing connection to the world he had been removed from. Reports on the operations and the people and the neighborhood, delivered in the careful language that both of them understood, was necessary, given that anything written to a federal prisoner was read by the institution before it was delivered. She had developed, over years, a capacity for communicating substantial information within the constraints of the readable letter, a kind of encoded ordinary correspondence that kept him genuinely informed about what was happening in Harlem without ever saying, in explicit terms, anything that could be used against either of them. He wrote back. His letters were different from hers in quality, if not in the care that produced them. They were more reflective, less operational, the letters of a man who had time to think and who was using the time. He wrote about the books he was reading and the ideas they had generated, and the specific questions he was working through in his mind. He wrote, occasionally, about the particular quality of the island itself, about what it was like to look at the mainland on clear days and to understand in your body, rather than just in your mind, the specific nature of your separation from it. He wrote, rarely, but with unmistakable weight when he did, about what he wanted to be when he came back, what he hoped would be different, what he intended to hold on to, and what he was willing to let go. These letters became, over the years, a record of a specific kind of thinking that neither of them had had occasion to do in the continuous motion of Harlem life. The removal of everything external had produced, in Bumpy's case, an engagement with internal questions that the external life had always deferred. What did he actually believe about the things he had always said he believed? What was the real foundation of the way he operated, and why had he built it that way, and was it still right? What did he want the rest of his life to look like? Not the operation, but the life inside and around the operation. Dorothy kept these letters. She kept them for the rest of her life, and the small number of people who were privileged to read them after her death all said the same thing, that they were unlike anything else in the record of who Bumpy Johnson was, that they showed a dimension of him that the public record, concerned as it was with his criminal enterprise and his confrontations with law enforcement and his various strategic victories and defeats, never captured. A man who was thinking, at depth, about what mattered and why, and how to be the person he wanted to be in the time he had left to be it. The relationship between Bennett and Bumpy, which began as adversarial and evolved into something more complicated, reached its most significant moment not in any confrontation or campaign, but in a conversation that occurred in Bennett's office about 3 years into Bumpy's time at Alcatraz. Bennett had been reading. He was, despite his professional orientation, toward the practical business of prison management. A man who read widely, and something he had encountered in his reading had produced a question that he found himself genuinely uncertain about, and that seemed, for reasons he was not entirely able to articulate, to be a question he wanted to put to Bumpy Johnson. The question was about justice, about what it meant and whether the institution he ran was, in any meaningful sense, connected to it. He asked the question directly, in the way he had learned was the only way to have a real conversation with Bumpy, who had no patience for indirection and who had demonstrated this through the specific quality of attention he paid to questions that were genuine and the equally specific quality of disengagement he displayed when questions were not. "Do you believe in justice?" Bennett asked. Bumpy considered the question for a moment, not performing consideration, not using the pause strategically, actually thinking. I believe in it the way I believe in a lot of things that don't fully exist yet, he said finally. It's real as a concept. It's real as something people are capable of creating when they try hard enough and care enough and have enough integrity to hold themselves to its actual requirements rather than their own convenience. But as a description of the world as it is, no, not often, not reliably. Bennett was quiet for a moment. And this place, is this justice? The question was remarkable. A warden asking a prisoner whether the facility he ran constituted justice was not the kind of question that occurred within the normal parameters of the relationship between the two. It was the kind of question that could only occur after the specific evolution of their particular relationship over 3 years. After Bennett had recognized that his campaigns had failed and had begun the harder work of trying to understand why. No, Bumpy said. This place is not justice. It's order. Those are different things, and the difference matters. Harold Bennett had tried to break him. His methods were real, his commitment genuine, his professional record before and after Bumpy Johnson one of consistent success. He had not succeeded, and the private notes he left behind said, in the handwriting of a man being honest with himself at the end of a long career, that he understood why. The Rock had tried, the Rock had failed, and Bumpy Johnson walked out of its shadow exactly as he had always been, and exactly as he had always intended to remain. Project content: Bumpy Johnson concept accreted by U transcript 3-bumpy.txt1 Linux transcript 5 Bumpy.txt1 Linux transcript 4-bumpy.txt1 Linux content